Let me set the scene for today's webinar on risk management. What I'm going to do is to have the webinar will be in three sections. The first section will be on the basics of risk management, so that once again we're all on the same page as to what is risk management and how risk management is being practiced by most people in the marketplace. So whether as individuals, as companies, or as groups, there's a specific way as to how people think risk management is practiced. How do we manage risk? And we call this the consequence and probability method of managing risk. So we look at something and we look at what's the probability of the risk happening, and then what's the impact to it if it happens. So this two-dimensional way of managing risk is what we do most of the time. So the first section of the webinar will be focusing on that. So people like internal auditors, risk and control practitioners, companies, risk officers, corporate secretaries, management, these are generally the familiar way of managing risk. So that's the first part of the presentation, so that we're on the same page. The second part of the presentation will be looking at how our mindsets, our cognitive behaviors sort of warp the way that we should present risk or manage risk. And we'll be sharing things like loss aversion, black swans, and other cognitive behaviors that affect how we manage risk, so that the traditional way of managing risk is not totally effective. And finally, the third section of our presentation will be on what should we do next if we can't manage risk in the traditional manner and we are affected by our behavior. Then what should be the right way or proper way of managing risk moving forward, especially when things are so unpredictable nowadays. You know, if we read the newspapers, it says that a lot of business models have to change because of the pandemic. But the challenge is that how do we know when's the next time going to be changed again? So change is going to be so constant that the way that we manage risk will have to change, because risk currently is being managed in two dimensions. So the way that we go about has to be less dependent on these two dimensions and look at it from a multi-dimensional point of view. I know it's going to be difficult to imagine right now, but in the second part of the presentation, when we look at cognitive behaviors, we'll be looking at a case study, the Samsung Note 7 fiasco, when phones started to explode in the planes and in pockets. That was in 2016, and how that affected the way that we see and manage risk. Yeah, so three parts. First is basics of risk management to get everybody on the same page, how people are using it. The second part of the presentation will be how our behavior and the way that we are wired will affect the way that we manage risk. We look at the Samsung case study, which is a quite exciting case study. A lot of people have forgotten about it, but I think it's still very pertinent even 4 years later, in 2020, also 4 years ago. And finally, we look at how should we manage risk moving forward. And to give you a hint, it's not about managing the risk, but really how do you manage the fallout. So the challenge is really to have this mindset that we got to let risk happen, because it's so difficult to predict and manage risk. So if you let risk happen, be it whatever it may be, then we deal with resilience. So when risk happens, how do you bounce back quickly, adapt and adopt to the new way of doing things? And that's really the way to manage risk moving forward, building resilience instead of focusing more on risk management. So that is in a nutshell what we're going to cover today for the coverage of this webinar today. It's just at 6:35 right now. So what I'll do is that I'll quickly jump to it. And as we go along, if you have questions to ask, please ask at any point in time. I've got my colleague, Ziwei, who will be answering your questions real time. The moment he answers a question, it will be published to all the participants in this webinar. As usual, I can't see you. I can't see you because I'm doing the presentation screen. So I can only see the slides and my own face. So I don't know who's in the webinar right now. But Ziwei, my wingman, will be able to see that and he will answer all your questions. But towards the end of the webinar, I'll be opening up the webinar to a group Q&A. And then you can ask me questions or Ziwei questions. I'll be happy to answer that. So with that, let me kick off this webinar by doing the synopsis. So the synopsis that you see here is already on the registration website. So I'll be following very closely to this synopsis. We will be covering things like loss aversion, summit fever or go fever. We're looking, so there's no slides on mountains. I promise you that this time around, nothing on mountains. I wouldn't even use the word summit fever. I replace it with go fever, which is very similar. We look at how things like loss aversion fit into a risk management framework, and we look at what are the best practices in communicating your risk management framework to your stakeholders. Bit of my background, my email address is up here. So if you need to contact me, for those who don't, my email address, or you forget it, I'm on LinkedIn, can contact me there anytime. And let me repeat the first 3 slides that we've been doing the last 3 webinars, and this is the 4th one. So every one of the 8 webinars, we're going to repeat this mantra: what is the most valuable currency today? And by now, for those of you who've been following this webinar, you notice that, or you remember that trust, we believe, is a cornerstone of how companies need to move ahead given the current situation. So more than ever now, companies and businesses need the trust of their stakeholders to prosper the long term. And what is trust? And we believe that trust has 8 components in that. And we started on 2nd of April with our first webinar on corporate culture, following on 24th of May with stakeholder engagement. Then in early June, we had one on business model. And finally, and so fourthly, today, we have one on 11 June on risk management. So we're halfway there. But as you watch them, you slowly realize that not only is a common element trust that links all of them, but you soon realize that all these 8 components are intertwined. So it's not just trust linking them, but corporate culture is linked to risk management. Risk management is linked to stakeholder engagement. Risk management is linked to tone at the top. It's linked to purpose. It's linked to sustainability, and it goes back and forth. So if you look at it as a whole, it's complicated. But when you watch each one of these webinars one by one, you understand the building blocks of trust and how slowly, as we go to each webinar, it starts to link together. So today's webinar will be recorded as usual, and by tomorrow it will be ready. So I will encourage you to watch the first 3 plus today's webinar. And as you watch it, as you go to the slides, which are freely downloadable, we truly believe that by now you start getting the gist of how trust is earned by organizations. And it's not easy to earn trust. It's not just through attending webinars or understanding the concept of trust and each of these 8 components, but it's really living and breathing each of these subcomponents of trust, or each of these 8 components of trust as you go about it. So risk management is today. As some of you may know me, risk management is very close to my heart. I've been talking about risk management for the last 20 years, and along the way, it's been good and bad. Good because it's a very endearing topic. Everybody understands risk management, compared to, say, 20 years ago when the understanding of it was quite surface level or none at all. But the challenge is that risk management has not evolved to the next level since the last 20 years. You know, the first risk management standard was only issued in 2009. And that's only 9 years ago, 12 years ago, and so 11 years ago. And since then, there's not been a lot of change. And last couple of years, there have been some changes to it, but it's very surface level. So one of the challenge today as we go to this webinar is really for you to believe that there's still a lot to evolve for risk management, and we need to change a lot of mindsets. So with that, I've set the tone hopefully as to the broad mindset as to what is trust and how risk management fits into this. As we go along these slides, there's about 50 of them slides, not a lot, compared to about 60 the last webinar on business model. But the trust is the cornerstone of every slide today as we go along. So as promised, there are 3 sections to this presentation. The first section is what is risk management, what are the basics, so that we're all on the same page, and really to understand what the market is doing as to how they're managing risk, so that we know how they're thinking, what they're thinking, and why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult to take what people have right now, what they understand, to the next level of understanding how to manage risk in a much better fashion moving forward in the days to come, in the weeks to come. You know, the challenge is that we don't change risk management now, with the change in business models, with the change in lifestyle, behavior. I truly am afraid that the risk will hit us harder the next time around. So we can't wait for risk to be managed. We need to be ready because it's going to hit any point in time. Now, let me share with you this standard definition of risk management. If you look at annual reports, if you look at how people manage the risk, how they talk about risk, you almost inevitably see this definition, or standard definition of risk, which is found in ISO 31000 at the bottom of the screen here. So ISO 31000 is the standard risk management framework that most companies in the marketplace use, whether listed companies or otherwise, or even universities or educational institutions, when they teach risk management, they generally use this standard. So it's generally acceptable, accepted, is familiar with most people. And the last version that was issued was in 2018, 2 years ago. The first version came out in 2009. So that's the first version. So you realize that risk management is relatively new as a formal concept, that the first risk standard was only 11 years ago. So it's a new thing, relatively new, 10 over years. But the challenge is that it has not changed much. Even with the 2018 version, it's more window dressing. If anything else, there's not been a major revamp as to how we look at risk and how we manage the risk. So there are four concepts here that you need to understand, the basic foundations of risk. And this definition is not wrong. So let me be very clear that this is a pretty good definition, but the challenge is how is it applied? Then that's where the challenge is. So the starting point of risk management is that the definition is that it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So these objectives are the things that you want to do. And if you remember the last webinar on business model, business objectives come about as a result of stakeholder engagement. When you engage with your stakeholders, you understand what they want. What's the purpose of serving stakeholders? And it is from purpose that you understand shared values. And it is through shared values that you have common objectives, meaning how do we get there and where do we want to go? These are the business objectives, if you remember the webinar on business models. So it is uncertainty. Is this going to happen or is this not going to happen? Effect of uncertainty objectives. So that's the starting point of the definition. And then the four parts of this definition. What are risk sources? And compare that to risk events or potential events. So risk sources are where risks appear. And we covered culture in our first webinar. So when culture is not so great, say for example, when there's a autocratic culture, like we learned in the first webinar, a culture where do as I say and don't do as I encourage. So it's very autocratic, very militaristic. That's why we see later on in the Samsung case study. If there's a bad culture or like you saw last webinar on business model in WeWork, it's a not so good culture. It is a result of that risks will appear. So potential event or things that go wrong will appear from or come up from risk sources. As we go along, you start to get what is a risk source, and we talk about the Samsung case study. So start to ingrain this in your mind that risk doesn't come out as a risk by itself. Risk comes out as a result of a source. What's the starting point of a risk event? So things don't just happen by itself. So for example, a car accident. A car accident doesn't just happen. So the accident is an event, but the event happened as a result of a source. So the source could be things like you've been working long hours, you've got things on your mind, you didn't have this habit of servicing your car. So all those are risk sources, and risk sources give rise to a risk event. When an event happens, there's a consequence or impact. Something happened, there's an impact, there's a consequence, and as a result, you lose something as a result of that event happening. And the likelihood is what we call probability. So is there a likelihood that this event will happen with a certain impact coming up from a specific risk source? So the definition is sound. I've looked at this definition for a long time, for at least the last 12 years. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this definition. And I will encourage you to adopt this definition because it keeps you on the straight and narrow in terms of being very disciplined and understanding risk management from a definition point of view. The challenge is really how do we apply it? Now, the next slide is really how most organizations apply risk management. And they essentially take two dimensions here, consequence and likelihood, and apply to how to identify events, what we call risks here. Now, this is a very common and easily recognizable framework or what we call the risk test. How do we know whether a risk will happen? This is what we call a 5x5 matrix, meaning that here there are 25 possibilities for a specific risk to happen. Let's take a particular risk event, which is the fourth, let me see, the second part of the definition of risk. Now, for example, let's say the risk of an accident happening, a car accident, for example, you're driving on the road, what's the risk of accident happening? We look at the likelihood. Let's say, for example, we think that there's a high likelihood of the risk happening because you've been working late and you're tired. So the risk source is tiredness and working late because you're under stress. So that's a risk source. And as a result of the risk source, there's a likelihood of a car accident happening. So let's say here is a likelihood. And if the car accident happens because you're driving in a very safe car, there's seat belts, there's airbags, and it's a reliable car model, the consequence of the impact is low, meaning that at most you get a whiplash because it's not a major, even if a major accident, you're well protected by a car. So the impact is low. You won't get into you won't be badly hurt. So you go through the impact which is low, and you look at this, you end up with a score of 8. So this typically is how organizations measure risk. They say if a score of 8, you give it a rating of green, and green means that it's a relatively low risk. Now, the way that these boxes are color-coded, it differs from most organizations, but this is generally about it. There's a red, yellow, and green way of categorizing risk. Some may color it a little differently, but by and large, it's around there. Yeah. So it's measured. So risk events are measured by a number. So if a risk is numbered at 8, it's a green. If it's numbered at 25, then it's what we call a red risk. So it's high impact, a high consequence, and a high likelihood. So meaning that if you drive a lousy car and you've been working really long hours, it's very likely that the risk will happen, and very likely that you get into a very bad injury because you're driving a lousy or old car. So a risk of 25 compared to a risk of 8, one is a green and one is a red. So you will see in law annual reports and the way that organizations communicate their risk, they will give some don't reveal the score, but they'll say, yeah, we got a certain risk in green, certain risk in yellow, a certain risk in red. And we look at these two dimensions, which is consequence and likelihood. So typically this is how risk, the definition of risk is applied in most annual reports and how it's practiced in managing risk in most organizations. Now, the challenge is that this is a very standard model, and the way that risk has evolved, the way that things is happening, and I'll make my case as I share with you the 3 sections of this presentation, how and why this particular way of managing risk is too basic and is too raw, and we need to evolve it to the next level to build resilience for organizations to be able to achieve their business objectives and make sure that their business models continue to work for the organization. And you notice that a lot of these slides will focus on culture as a major source of risk events for the organization, as we see through the Samsung Note 7 case study, the Galaxy Note 7, which is a really, really interesting case study and very exciting. And I will encourage you to read more about it. So keep this in your mind as we look at these 2 dimensions, consequence and likelihood. Last week in our business model presentation, we talked about the business model found in the International Integrated Reporting Framework, May 2020. For many of you who are familiar with the Integrated Reporting Framework, you will find this very familiar, what we call the octopus diagram. For those who are not familiar with the octopus diagram, I do encourage you to read the IR or Integrated Reporting Framework, which is, let me just give me a second, I noted this. Which is linked at the bottom here, the International IR Framework. This is the typical business model that is shown here. And in this star here is where risk is featured as part of the business model. So you can see that in addition to purpose, mission, vision, which we talked about last week as part of your business model, the key component of the business model is risk and opportunities, looking at 2 dimensions. I won't spend too much time on this particular diagram because that was covered a fair bit in last webinar on business model. So please go back to that recording and and go through that. But the challenge is that how do you mix in risk into the business model? And from my experience and from my discussions and review of a lot of communications, a lot of annual report, is very siloed. So the business model and the way that company, two different sets of thinking. What we need to do is really merge these two into one. And because risk, the way it's defined, the way it's practiced, and the way the business model are drawn up, it causes this silo thinking in many organizations. So this by itself is a major challenge. So one tip that I would encourage for you to take down is that if you are developing a business model, strategy, business objectives for your organizations, you need to think clearly how to embed risk management into your business model. This is clearly not well done in many organizations. So please take note of that. You need to really truly learn how to embed it into the business model. So let me clear this. This is a diagram that's also from the ISO 31000 2018 risk standard. By the way, I will encourage you to buy the risk standard from ISO website. I think it's about $30 or $40 US. It's not expensive, it's not thick. It's relatively easy to read, but if you are managing business models, you don't have to be a risk practitioner to read through the ISO standard of risk. By itself, it's good reading. It gives you a good foundation of risk management. But the challenge again, once again, is really how do you apply all these principles of risk management so that it's effective in the real world. And besides the definition of risk management, this particular risk management framework that is on this page is generally adopted in some way or one form or the other in many organizations' communications, whether it's on the website or on the annual reports or in their communication object materials. They will have some form of diagram which is very, very similar to this, which begs to has not evolved a lot beyond this particular diagram here. So the 5x5 matrix that you saw earlier with the red, yellow, and green diagram, plus this framework has not changed much over the last 10, 20 years. So that's something that we need to rethink carefully as to how we should evolve given today's environment that's moving so quickly in terms of how risk is being managed. In fact, that should be an oxymoron. Risk management is an oxymoron. It's very difficult to manage risk or what we call risk management. More importantly, it's really how do we build resilience. Now, this is a very, very monumental report, I would call it. Back when I was teaching risk management at the university, I was using this as an example. And even the last 7 years, if I read about it, read the report again, a lot of things in there has not changed. You still look at things in the same manner as is today. Look at the global risk, and a lot of the global risk has not really changed. Of course, the impact and likelihood will have shifted a little bit, and they still use the matrix of impact and likelihood. But more importantly, this particular global risk report, which is issued every year by the World Economic Forum, and it's a really, really good report. I do encourage you to read it. One of the first time in the 8th edition of this report is to look at how risks are interconnected. If you look at the various 50 risks, the previous editions of this report look at risk relatively from a standalone perspective. There's some interconnectivity, but they don't look at it from a holistic, interconnected perspective. And here, this is very important for participants here to understand that in many organizations, how they report and how they manage the risk by itself is done in a very siloed manner. So if you look at the top 10 risks or top 20 risks, they look at the matrix, the 5x5, they rank the risks, red, yellow, and green. But it's by itself is done in connected. Now the next slide is going to blow you away because you look at how all these 50 global risks are interconnected in such a way that even 7 years ago and today is still extremely relevant. And this is how it looks like. When I first saw this particular diagram, once again, I was totally blown away because the way that it's interconnected, the way it's grouped together, made me really realize that 7 years ago when I first read this, I asked myself, I don't understand this. I told myself, it was very abstract, I would say. But today, when I look back on it, I'll say, wow, it now really makes sense. Digital wildfires, hacking events, privacy, loss of data, economic and environmental resilience, global warming, climate change, supply chain disruption, the dangers of hubris or over-reliance or overconfidence in our human health system, vulnerability to pandemics, rising rate of chronic diseases, antibiotic resistance, unforeseen consequences of new science technologies, AI. So all these things were brought up 7 years ago in 2013, but yet, if you go back, and I encourage you to go to this website down here to read this risk report, you will notice that a lot of things that were brought up 7 years ago is still absolutely relevant. And the other thing that was brought up in this 2013 report is really this concept of resilience. Because in this report, they say that we cannot manage risk anymore. That was 7 years ago, and yet managing risk has not changed over the last 7 years. But 7 years ago, this report said that we can't manage risk. We can't depend on risk management. We have to build resilience. We have to believe and accept that risk can and will happen behind us. They come and reach out to us when you least expect it. It's really the ability to build the resilience to bounce back, recover, adapt, adopt, and then come back stronger than ever, and then keep on moving in that cycle, rather than spending your time thinking about how to manage the risk that's about to come. Yeah. So 7 years ago, the warning signs were there already, but yet, the pandemic happened. So 7 years ago, the warning signs were there, and it's rated as a top 50 global risk, and it's interconnected with everything. So disruption to supply chain, privacy, loss of security, hacking, all these coming together, interconnectivity of risk has come true today, predicted 7 years ago. And yet, we were not prepared for it. And you've got to ask yourself why. It's not as if we don't know. The risk reports, the 2013 risk reports commonly read, and many other reports, many other, I won't call it predictions, but many other analyses were done as a result. So why did it happen? And every time a crisis happened, a global financial crisis, a subprime crisis, governance and risk management regulations, wear a mask, everything is done after every crisis. So why do we do things on hindsight? On hindsight, of course, we are 2020, we are very clear as to what to do, but sometimes we may not survive with hindsight. And what happens then? There's no more risk to manage because we won't be around to manage risk because we'll be dead by then. So why do we ignore red flags? So we've covered the first part of our presentation today. We looked at the basics of risk management, the definition. We look at how organizations manage risk in a 5x5 traditionally framework. We look at the red, yellow, and green matrices. So risks which come up from a risk source leading to a risk event. So risk source is, say, stress, lack of sleep. A risk event is a car accident. The impact and likelihood of it happening will fall into that 5x5 matrix. So your score will be between 1 to 25 as to whether what is the risk rating for the risk event coming up from the risk source. And based on this matrix, we've seen things like the Global Risk Report, where we look at how they rank the top 50 risks in 2013 and how those risks are interconnected, but yet we miss all the signs. We end up with a situation where we look back and say, oh, we should have seen it. Yes, we should have seen it. So why do we ignore red flags? So come back to the second part of our presentation. Why do we ignore red flags? And in the second part, I will look at this concept called cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are things that we are born with, our innate behavior, that we are blinded by the things that are us, that as human beings, we have cognitive biases or behaviors that unfortunately blind us to the red flags that are waving right in front of us, and we should have done something about it. And we also look at certain experiments, look at certain books, and we'll give you a way of thinking. So we're changing the way of thinking so that when you move ahead, you suddenly realize that, hey, the basic way in which we manage risk is not sustainable anymore. So you see the word sustainability come into place. The webinar number 8 will be on sustainability framework. So how do you sustain risk management so that you can achieve your business models and serve the purpose of for your stakeholders? So it's all intertwined and all leading to trust that we engender for our stakeholders and the marketplace for the organization. So why do we ignore red flags? Let me start by going to a shocking experiment. So this is a very interesting experiment. It's real, so it's not made up, but please don't try it yourself, because I'm not sure what's the effect on you. But here, the experiment, I think it was 1972, and since then, I think they've not been allowed to repeat it because of ethical rules. But I'll be happy to try it on you if you want to. I'll just assign a disclaimer for me. Now, here, the experimenters got two groups of people. They grouped them into Group A and Group B. Group A were told that you will 100% guaranteed receive a small electric shock. So you will 100% be guaranteed to receive a small electric shock. And the second group of people in Group B were told that there's a 50% chance, only 50% chance of you receiving the same electric shock, a small electric shock, but the same one. So, and the researchers, the experimenters, then measured the level of anxiety, heart rate, nervousness, whether they were sweating cold sweat, of both groups before they were being shocked, before the switch was being turned on. So bear in mind that Group A were guaranteed 100% they'll get a shock, and Group B were given were told that there was only 50% chance when they turn on the switch you get a shock. So 50% you get shocked, 50% chance you may not get shocked. And the result of the test was that both participants were equally anxious. So the anxiety levels were exactly the same, even though the probability of being shocked was different between Group A and Group B. So the level of stress was exactly the same, even though the probability was different for Group A and Group B. So bear it in mind, the level of anxiety was exactly the same. Now, compared to the second part of the experiment here, so Group A, once again, were told that you will guaranteed receive a shock, but this time the shock level will go up. So instead of X volts, it will go up by a bigger shock to you when I turn on the switch. And Group B, same thing, will increase the level of shock, a much bigger shock here, won't kill you, but it will certainly give you a much bigger shock based on the voltage. But the same probability, the probability remains the same, meaning that there's still a 50% chance of you getting the bigger shock. And the researchers found that when they told this to the Group A and Group B participants, the anxiety levels for both groups before they were being shocked, before the switch was turned, the anxiety levels rose by the same degree. So they were affected by the impact, but the probability was not relevant here for Group B. So Group B and for Group A, the impact went up, the level of shock went up, but the level of anxiety went up exactly the same for both groups. So once again, the level of probability here did not play any bearing, did not have a bearing on the anxiety level of the group. It was exactly the same. The experiment is even more interesting here. For this, what we call shocking, literally shocking experiment. So here we focus on Group B. So Group B were told you will get an electric shock, but at the same time they were told that electric shock will reduce from 50% to 20% to 10% and then to 5%. So each time they were told that the chance of being shocked, the probability will keep on reducing. Now, the interesting thing is that the stress level remain exactly the same, even though the level of probability will keep on going down. So this conclusively proved that the concept of likelihood or probability in terms of this risk event. So the risk event is being shocked. So there's a risk of you being shocked, 50% chance. There's a risk of you being shocked. So even though the chance level or the level of probability keep on going down, the level of anxiety remains exactly the same, irrespective of the probability. So based on this shocking experiment, and there are a lot of other similar experiments you can read out there in terms of looking at the probability or likelihood as a concept. It proves that from a behavior point of view, we respond to the impact of the event here, but not to its likelihood. So the important lesson to learn from this cognitive behavior is that we lack an intuitive grasp on probability, meaning that from a human perspective, from a behavior perspective, from a thinking point of view, from the logical way that we deduce things, we are not influenced by likelihood. We are influenced by consequence or impact here. So if that's is on consequence, then how does a two-dimensional matrix work? So we are looking at it from only a one dimension, meaning consequence or impact. If you look at the impact of the electric shock, it's going to be painful. So it doesn't matter whether it's 50%, 20%, 5% of the chance of the electric shock happening. There's still a chance, but the person's focus is on the consequence. So how do you think? It's very difficult to grasp a single dimensional way of looking at risk. So meaning that if you have no concept of the risk happening to you, you need to look at, is it going to happen and what's the impact? So yes, it's going to happen or no going to happen. So it's really very binary thinking. No, it's going to happen and what's the impact? Yes, it's going to happen, what's the impact? And this kind of binary thinking has led to this thing called the pandemic. Sorry, let me just clear this annotation. So let me repeat this slide again because it's a very important slide here. So if we only focus on consequence of the impact, how do you then manage risk? If we look at the traditional way of applying a risk definition. So the definition of risk is not wrong. It is really how it's applied from a consequence and impact likelihood compared to probability, a two-dimensional impact here with regards to managing risk. So this concept of cognitive bias here is called neglect of probability. You can Google that when you finish with this webinar. That trips us up in terms of how do we manage risk. So we have a lack of intuitive grasp of probability or what we call likelihood. So we don't focus likelihood, we focus on only the impact. Now this was The Economist magazine that was published at the end of January 2020 this year. And there was an article in there which I've given you the link here at the bottom. And the title of this article is, will the Wuhan virus become a pandemic? And the writer wrote, probably. So here, when someone reads this article, they will ignore from a behavior point of view, they will ignore the word probably. So what do you think they'll focus on? They'll focus on the word Wuhan. And Wuhan is in the province of Hubei in China. And here you see a picture of a Chinese flag on a mask on the Chinese continent. So the challenge is that from a behavior point of view, we view this as something as something that has impacted a city that's very far away. So the probability perspective doesn't feature as much as the impact. And you realize that for many organizations, they still think that it's a China thing, it's a Wuhan thing, and it probably will not impact me. It's something very far away. And by the time it affects the organization or the country, a very good example of how the thinking about what we call the neglect of probability kicks into place when you want to manage risk. So this is a typical example of how standard risk management cannot kick in alone. You can use it. So I'm not saying that the standard risk management 5x5 does not work, but it is a way of thinking that constricts us and blinds us to the reflex that's coming up in front of you. So you really need to keep it as a starting point, but you need to evolve it because probability, likelihood is one dimension that is ignored by us human beings, the way that we see it, because it's a cognitive behavior of what we call neglect of probability that allows us to make wrong decisions when it comes to managing risk. So neglect of probability is one big cognitive bias that is bearing on how we manage risk in the marketplace. Now I'm covering the next cognitive bias. So remember this phrase cognitive bias here. The second cognitive bias I would like to share with you is called loss aversion. So there's a tendency for people to strongly prefer avoiding losses than acquiring gains, meaning that would you rather lose $100 or gain $100? So this is a challenging concept because people don't get it, because it's as with most cognitive biases, it is we are blind to cognitive biases because we are the way that we are wired. We can't see it because it's an innate part of human nature. Just like neglect of probability, we naturally ignore probability, but we don't realize it. We naturally have aversion to losses, but we don't realize it. So, for example, in today's market, if you have a loss in a share that you have bought, and this keep on continuing bad news, you wouldn't want to sell to lock in the loss because of loss aversion, even though you may gain $100 as a result of selling the loss by putting it somewhere else. So you rather not lose something, but and try to think about not gaining the other way around. So it's a difficult topic, but let me go through the example of the Samsung case study, and you realize that it become a bit clearer as we go through it. And with loss aversion, the other thing that kicks in is what we call risk shift. We are risk seeking in losses and risk averse in gains. So our risk appetite increases when we are losing. For those of you who understand the concept of gambling, when you're losing in gambling, there's this term called double or nothing. So you lost $100 and you have the next chance to gain back $100. You put in all your money in order to make a bet so that if you double the bet, you gain back everything that you lost. But to double or nothing is you take a higher level of risk that you normally do because you're losing. So all this behavior lead people to making wrong decisions when it comes to managing risk. And you realize that once again in the Samsung case study, people make the wrong risk decisions as a result of these three cognitive behaviors that we covered so far. So neglect of probability, loss aversion, and risk shift. So once again, it's very challenging concepts to understand because we are geared not to realize that it's happening to us. So we don't get it when we read about it because we are geared not to get it. But when we look at example, the probability, we are averse to losses when we have shifted to taking more risk, or what we call go fever. Go fever is another term for risk shift where people do things in a much more reckless way because they are facing tight deadlines. So when you're facing a tight deadline, you tell your team, go and work faster, go work overtime, go and put in more resources. So this is where the term go fever comes about. Go fever actually came from the Man to the Moon project when the US wanted to send the man to the moon. So they were rushing to get things done, and as a result of go fever, Apollo 1 caught fire on the ground and killed 3 astronauts. So Google go fever, go fever, summit fever about climbing mountain, risk shift, is all as a result of being averse to losses. So averse to losses meaning that you rather avoid a loss, you rather do something about it rather than do things that result in a loss. And that is the way that we blind ourselves to seeing the red flags. The other couple of biases that I want to cover is the outcome bias, and the next one is called you can't argue with success bias. Now, this is a really great book that I encourage you to read. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. For all risk practitioners, for all people who want to understand human behavior and cognitive biases, this is the father of all cognitive behaviors or cognitive biases textbooks. And it's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So it's a bit technical to read, I must warn you. But if you want to do a deep dive into how biases affect how we behave and how that applies to risk management and how organizations behave, this is a very good fundamental book to understand. The other book is Dan Ariely, which you'll cover in a while. But outcome bias is that what we call you can't argue with success. So if you do things that have been successful at the time, even though the way that you're doing it is questionable. So let's say, for example, you get from your home to your office, and you drive at very high speed. And most of the time, or all the time, you get there safely, nothing happened. After a while, you soon believe that you always get there safely, but it's fundamentally unsound. So because you drive at high speed, but the fact that you don't get into an accident, you tell people you can't argue with success. You drive at high speed from point A to point B, something is going to go wrong sooner rather than later. The fact that nothing has gone wrong doesn't mean that it's not going to go wrong. This is what I call outcome bias. So if you look at the Samsung case study, they've been rushing a lot of things. They've been pushing very hard to get the models out, but nothing has gone wrong so far until until the Note Model 7 came out, the Galaxy Note 7. And that was when something has gone wrong. And that's when you really can't argue with failure. So outcome bias is another cognitive bias that is popularized by Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow. Another cognitive bias is called normalization or deviance bias. Now, believe me, probably by now I say, wow, Wanchan, these are really very scientific, very technical, difficult concept to understand. But I will help you to understand how to apply these topics as we go to the Samsung case study. Then it becomes clearer. And as you rewatch this webinar, things will get a bit clearer. When I first started teaching cognitive biases, well, probably about 10 years ago, it took me a while before I finally get it and how to apply it by understanding more case studies. So I encourage you to not to despair when some of these technical terms you say, wow, actually is way beyond me. It was way beyond me also initially, but when I look at case studies, I suddenly realize, aha, I should have seen it. And that's really the nature of cognitive bias. You can't see it until you force yourself to see it. And because this is a cognitive behavior, we are naturally blind to them. So normalization or deviance bias is that we have a tendency to adopt, to see things as normal, even though they're risky. So the often given example is that when you climb a broken ladder, a ladder with a broken rung, every time you climb it, nothing goes wrong. So you feel that it's all right. So you keep on climbing it and nothing goes wrong. And after a while, you believe that it's normal. So it's just like doing everything, just like climbing an unbroken ladder, be it may. But ladder is broken, and sooner or later, you're going to fall. But because of this bias called normalization or deviance, you feel that everything is okay, even though you're climbing a broken ladder. So once again, in a deviance bias have kicked in. In the Samsung case study, ignorance of probability, normalization of deviance bias, you can't argue with success, and avoidance of loss, risk shift. All these are the biases that keep on appearing again and again in the Samsung case study. And the final cognitive bias, so there's only 4 or 5 biases I'm introducing to you. There are hundreds of them, literally. There's another book called The Art of Thinking Clearly, and by Rolf Dobelli. The Art of Thinking Clearly, that's another great book about 100 different types of cognitive biases which we succumb to. Everyday things that we behave in, that we're blind to. So that's another good book, but I've not listed it here yet. But here's another good book here, called The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. And he was the first one to introduce the concept of black swan. So a black swan is another concept that's similar to neglect of probability. Black swan events are events which are extremely rare, meaning that very difficult to predict. And when they happen, they have a severe impact on the organization or on the person. And when they happen, even though they've been unpredictable, we think that they're going to happen again. So it's an oxymoron. But examples of black swan that is quoted in the book, or similar example in New York on September 11, Google. So the concept of search engine is a black swan. The Sydney Opera House is a black swan. Things that you cannot imagine happening, but has happened. And when it's happened, there's a great impact. So the impact can be both positive and negative. COVID-19, Facebook, all these are things that has but when it happens, we think that it's possible. So that's where the oxymoron comes about. And every time it happens, it has a severe impact, both positive and negative, on organizations or countries. So every time something unpredictable happens, we call it a black swan. So COVID-19 global pandemic, we say, wow, it's a black swan. Facebook happens when it first came out. We say that, oh, we should have thought of it, but it's such a big impact and such a rarity, we call it a black swan. The black swan concept came about when people in Europe believed that there was no such thing as a black swan. So when they say this is a black swan event, they say that what they meant was that there's no such thing as that was going to happen until they discovered black swan in Australia. So read this book. It's, by the way, just a fair warning, it's a very technical book. Black swan is not easy to understand, but you want to do a deep dive into the concept of black swans and how it impacts risk management. I encourage you to read it. But black swan is generally not a major thing in today's thinking when it comes to risk management, not as much as say 10 years ago. It's less quoted nowadays and used more sparingly compared to other concepts. So let me get to the case study now. Now, bear in mind, this case study only happened about 4 years ago. So it's a relatively new example, new case study. It's still fresh in our mind, but a lot of people may have forgotten about it. So go back, do read it, and I provided to you all the links and the news articles on this particular case study. And let me refresh your mind as to the definition of risk management. So there are 4 components of definition of risk management. Risk sources, where do the risks come from? So must remember that risk comes out from something. Risk doesn't appear from something. So when the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 exploded in the plane, caught fire in your pocket, caused damage, it doesn't appear just like that. The risk event doesn't appear. A car accident doesn't appear. It resulted as a result of a source. Something gave rise to that risk event or potential event. So we call it a risk source. And in this Samsung case study, the risk source is very clearly the culture of Samsung. So the corporate culture was a source of this risk. And the source of this risk was also the tone at the top. So remember, the one of the topic for this tone at the top, culture are sources of risk, or what we call potential events. And will these events have impact or consequence? Yes, of course, something will happen. And for those of you old enough to remember the Galaxy Note 7, the consequence of the impact was that Samsung lost $10 billion of sales. $10 billion of sales and $5 billion of profits when they on 11 October 2016. So the consequence impact was tremendous. Now, could they have foreseen this impact? Could they have seen the likelihood, the probability of this event? Now, if they have foreseen it, they would have managed this risk better. They wouldn't have lost so much money, reputational risk. They lost their leadership in terms of smartphones. So we are aversion to losses, loss aversion, risk shift, go fever. You can't ignore you can't argue with success, deviation of bias. So all these are the biases that blinded Samsung, I totally believe, blinded Samsung to the tune of $10 billion of sales and $5 billion of profits, and discontinuation within a period of 3 months of the biggest launch of ever in terms of their smartphone models in those days. They launched on 2nd August. By 11 October of the same year, they stopped production of the model Galaxy Note 7 in that short period of time, losing $10 billion. Unbelievable. Such of such magnitude, and yet they could not have managed the risk because they were blind to its likelihood. So with that background in mind, let me go through the details of this case study. But it's an amazing case study that it's good to share with your organizations, with if you're a teacher, with your classes, with your students, as to understanding cognitive biases and how the present way of managing risk is very difficult to apply when it comes to managing risk in today's world of pure uncertainty. Risk is uncertainty. So the level of uncertainty is even higher. Ability to predict likelihood, the ability to look at probability is even lower or more unknown. So you can't even look at probability. And so what do you do about it? So the last part of my presentation is really the call to action. What should we do about it? It is really building reliance in addition to managing the risk. building better reliance on yourself and on the system, and not just on managing risk, because we can see that just managing risk alone blind us to all these things that's going to happen. So let's quickly jump into the case study here. You can't argue with success. Now, Samsung has been very successful in their models of Galaxy Note. They've been the first one models. By the way, they skipped Note 6 because they want to synchronize with the other Note, rather the other Galaxy models. So not because they wanted to compete with iPhone 7. So 2nd of August 2016 was the unveiling, the launch of the Galaxy Note 7, the smartphone that thinks big. So it was a major launch in New York City, and the phone was going to be available 2 weeks from 2nd August. So a big fanfare, huge launch, lots of confidence. You can't argue with success because the moment it was launched on 2nd of August, the pre-orders from just South Korea alone broke all records. Broke all records with 200,000 units pre-ordered within 2 days. So 200,000 units pre-ordered within 2 days. You can't argue with success. It's huge. And all the reviews, if you read the 2nd August reviews by all the tech magazines, by all the news channels, is sometimes people call it the best iPhone, not best iPhone, the best smartphone that money can buy. So it was a confidence builder. You can't argue with success. So you basically are blinded by this behavior, this cognitive bias called you can't outcome bias. So you start to equate outcome bias with a scenario right now. You start to understand how it works. So this is outcome bias. The outcome here as a result of the launch of 2nd August is you can't argue with success. Who's going to tell Samsung that in less than 3 months' time, or in about 3 months' time, or from August, September, by October 11, you're going to lose $10 billion of sales? Nobody in Samsung is going to believe you that, and you just brush you off and say, no, get out of my way. You can't argue with success. So remember this date, 2nd of August. A few weeks later, just less than a month, just about a month later, on 2nd September, the risk event happened. So the phones exploded, caught fire. These are what we call risk events. When the phone explodes, when a car gets in an accident, it doesn't just happen. Something caused the risk event to happen. What is the risk source? What's the risk source? Has been the definition of risk. So for a risk event to happen, there must be a source to it. And so on 2nd of September, here, 2.5 million units. So 2.5 million units of Samsung Galaxy Note 7 was sold by 2nd of September 2016. Samsung was very successfully sold 2.5 million units since its launch of 2nd of August. So within a 1 month period, they sold 2.5 million units. And on 2nd September, they would say to everybody, because something has gone wrong. So where is the risk source? So this risk event, and at the same time, Apple was going to announce their iPhone 7 on September 16. So remember, now you must notice that there's a coming together of event. You can't argue with success, they'll be very successful. And yet there's this risk event, the phones caught fire. Risk event happened, and Samsung is going to, Apple is going to launch their iPhone in about 10 days time, 9 days time. So it's not too far away. So there's a coming together of a lot of events. So it's not just the phones catching fire, but really the risk of losing market share to Apple, the risk of Apple iPhone 7 being much better when it's launched on September the 16th. So there were a lot of things that's coming together and could lead a lot of things going wrong for Samsung. So here, what we call go fever kicks into place. Risk shift comes to place. So the risk has started to shift from loss aversion to risk shift to go fever. Same thing, but it's just intensity has just increased. So here Samsung starts to do the unbelievable. They started to rush things even though a lot of things has gone on very bad. So remember, this is only 1 month away from 2nd August to 2nd September. So within a month, they had to do something very major. But what was the thing that led them to recalling 2.5 million units in such a short period of time? Within 1 month, they do it. So the phone started exploding, catching fire within 2 weeks after they started selling. But soon after that, they started to launch, started to do the recall. So let me just clear this first. And the risk source was the battery, of all things. Yeah, the battery caused a fire, but it is really the design of the battery in the first place and the replacement of the battery between battery A and B that caused the fire. Let me explain. Samsung used 2 types of batteries for their phone. First, they used battery A in their phone that they first sold in the 2.5 million Samsung Galaxy Note in the marketplace. They used battery A. And then they initially thought there was battery A that caused the fires in their phone, but their testing was incomplete. But they rushed it because they wanted to go out to the marketplace to do the recall. So remember, the recall was on 2nd August, 2nd September. So that's within a month of the launch of the Galaxy Note 7. Within a month, they launched the recall. Within a month, they sold 2.5 million units and wanted to recall the number of units. Now, that's a very quick turnaround. Now, Samsung did that because they wanted to repair the damage to reputation and the damage to the marketplace. Galaxy Note 7. So they made a rush decision to replace the battery A with battery B. But they didn't realize that battery B had the same problem. Battery A was actually from a Samsung subsidiary, which made phones for the Galaxy Note 7. Battery B was from a third-party battery manufacturer, but the same battery caused battery B caused the same problem in the Galaxy Note 7 model. To replace the batteries in the Galaxy Note model as part of the recall, and after replacing it, the same fires, the same exploding Galaxy Note 7 happened again in the marketplace. So in their rush to get things done, so go fever, summit fever, risk shift start to kick in. Loss aversion, they want to lose. So gaining market share wasn't on their mind, but they didn't want to lose more market share. So loss aversion, risk shift, go fever, they're all intertwined here. So you look at the top here, these 3 separate cognitive biases of human behavior are now starting to get a bit blurred. They're intertwined, but actually there are 3 different types of cognitive biases here. And the concept of you can't argue with success has gone away, at least for a while, because now you can argue with failure. So success now has gone away. The 200,000 pre-order success has gone away. It's now shifted into the next gear, which is trying to avoid losses and trying to do things as fast as possible. And the risk source was not just, it's not the replacement of the battery. The replacement of the battery was another risk event. And this risk event was caused by the need to rush. And why is there a need to rush? It all boils down, and you soon see the corporate culture of rushing, the corporate culture of getting things done quickly, short-term thinking, the tone from the top, that management had no idea about technology. Management did not understand why things were done. The rush to compete with Apple in terms of their iPhone leadership. So all these were the risk sources. So the fact that battery A and battery B were faulty, these were risk events. These are still not the risk source. So the phone exploding was caused by the battery. The battery by itself a risk event. So what were then the risk source? And we come to that in a while. So in a short period of time, from 2nd August to 2nd September to 11 October, so Samsung takes $11 billion hit of sales, $10 billion of sales gone, bye-bye. $5 billion of profits gone, bye-bye. $17 billion of market share gone, bye-bye on 11 October when they announced the halt to the production of the Galaxy Note 7. So billions of dollars lost because of cognitive biases. Of course, other things kick in too. But again, the key question is really, what is the risk source? The ultimate question here. We understand the risk event. We understand the ignorance of probability. We understand the impact. So we know the final question is that what was the risk source? Why? What was the cause? What's the root cause of all this risk event? So here's a good summary of the timeline which I attribute to this author here. So 2nd August, they released, they launched it. 19th August, they started to sell it. 24th August, first report explosion. 2nd September, first recall. So you notice that from the first time, the first report of the explosion in about a week's time. So the moment of the first report, so they probably would have known about some of these problems already before the 24th. But even if it's 24th, a week or thereabouts to have a recall of 2.5 million globally of the Galaxy Note 7 is a major task. And to be able to manufacture battery B in time to replace all the batteries A's out there is a major effort. So it's not simple. And then on September 2nd was a global recall excluding US, and then it was included. And then after the replacement on October the 1st, the first reported case of the replaced node replacement exploded happened even after the replacement. And within 10 days after that, on October 11, the production of Galaxy Note 7 was permanently discontinued. So very short time frame, August 2nd up to October 11. To lose so much in such a short period of time was really a case study in its making. All this was a culture of rush, culture of getting done very quickly, culture of go fever. And let me show you soon. So the neglect of probability in this article, this has been a bit of a perfect storm for Samsung. So perfect storm is all the things that you cannot imagine. So remember the 3 factors for black swan to happen. First, it must be totally unpredictable, unforeseen, or extremely low level of possibility, such that you never think of it. But when it happens, there's a huge impact on the organization. So $10 billion of sales. And finally, when it happened, you think that it will happen again. So imagine from now on, Samsung will have an extensive test of their batteries for any new models on their mobile phones or smartphone. And it is a case. If you read through the development of how Samsung tested their batteries subsequent to this risk event, they now have a super duper complex way of testing all the batteries before it's gone up. But this after the event. Remember the normalization of deviance, the bias. So normalization of deviance, you keep on climbing the broken ladder again and again with nothing going wrong, you think that's okay. So they were using faulty batteries again and again and again, even probably before Note 7. But after you fall off the ladder, after the thing has gone wrong, you suddenly realize that, oops, the ladder is broken. The design of the battery was not good enough. Yeah. I know I got about another 20 minutes to go. I'll be finishing soon. So once again, in the effort to, or in the drive to avoid losses or loss aversion in risk shifting. So here they was still doing the, between the time of finding out they were exploding phones and recalling on 2nd September. So they were all on tight deadlines. Remember, they had a week or so to announce the recall in 2nd of September and replace faulty battery A with battery B. While they were testing the batteries, for battery A and battery B to be replaced, they were told, so the hundreds of testers were told that they cannot communicate with others. So the management told them that they were supposed there to be no emails. Can you imagine that? The testers were not allowed to communicate with one another. No emails were allowed between the testers because Samsung was fearful of losses and subpoenas in the US market and other markets. So loss aversion kicked in and they took more risks. Surely they will know that by not communicating, things will go even more wrong. But they were so fearful of more losses, more subpoenas, more lawsuits, they say, no, cannot email each other. So this added to the things that were going wrong even more significantly. So from one exploding phone to another exploding phone to the total discontinuation of the battery of the Samsung Galaxy Note model. So rush. No emails. Right, but this is still not the root cause. This is still not the risk source. This still only the risk event. So rushing to meet tight deadline, so all risk events. So what was the risk source? Samsung's fight to compete with Apple by cramming in increasingly sophisticated features into the device. So they were cramming more stuff into the phone because they wanted to compete with Apple. So it is this competition, this blind competition to be better, because Samsung was behind. They wanted to be number one in the marketplace. They wanted to be better, stronger, faster, putting more features, more complex than any other phone manufactured. So in the race to surpass iPhone, Samsung packed it with so much innovation that it became uncontrollable. So uncontrollable, meaning that no matter how you manage it, it's going to go wrong. So how do you manage risk when they start to ignore probability? It's uncontrollable. You cannot control it at all. So there's nothing to control, nothing to manage when it comes to risk. They were just blind to it. So one of the risk source is competition. So when you compete, so when your organization has crazy targets, sales targets, your organizations have KPIs are a lot. So if you look at integrated reporting, integrated thinking, long-term thinking, they look at short-term goals, which have typically KPIs, short-term goals, and then long-term thinking, which is non-financial KPIs, things that take longer to achieve. So non-financial KPIs, things like sustainability, climate change. So the balance between long-term and short-term thinking need to kick in order to manage all these resources that comes from competitive thinking. And things like short-term contracts for CEOs, short-term contracts, short-term KPIs for management, for sales staff. These are the risk sources that lead to behavior, lead to performance that are not aligned with the things that should be done properly. So competition is a risk source. Culture is another risk source here. So in this article, it says that Samsung had a corporate culture that compounded any issues. Former Samsung employees described the workplace as militaristic, very top-down driven, where orders came from people high above who did not necessarily understand how product technologies actually work. So imagine that, people who were very autocratic, militaristic, do it my way or the highway, set targets, do things this way, notwithstanding the fact that they didn't understand how technology works. I want the phone to be this size and do these things, I didn't get it done. So the engineers were just under a lot of short-term pressure, high pressure, intense pressure to get things done in a very quick manner. And guess what? If you look at, try to fit it in as best as they can, but it became uncontrollable. It was not innovation anymore. It was trying to pack things in. It was an outcome based. You can't argue with success or perceptibly seemingly success, but it was just cramming in things. So culture is a risk source. So competition and culture are two resources. So here another article in New York Times. In the Samsung's culture, managers will constantly feel pressured to prove themselves with short-term achievement. So short-term KPIs, short-term gains, and executives felt that they were afraid to lose their jobs, even though they knew that the goals were excessive. So the targets were crazy targets, unachievable targets to be number one in the marketplace, militaristic culture. So there was a coming together of what we call in an article a perfect storm for the organization, a perfect storm for uncontrollable, something that cannot be managed, that you cannot bounce back from, losing $10 billion of sales, $17 billion of market share, market capitalization, and $5 billion of profit for the group as a whole. Of course, Samsung survived, but can you imagine if they had not? So many organizations need to look at risk source, risk event, the impact, and is it controllable? If it's uncontrollable, how are you going to manage it? So that's one thing. That's why it's so important to understand cognitive biases. So we looked at 5 or 6 cognitive biases. We look at loss aversion. We look at risk shift. We look at neglect of probability. We look at outcome-based bias. We look at normalization of deviance, and we look at risk shift. So these at least 6 cognitive biases that we just covered there. But I say in Rolf Dobelli's book, The Art of Thinking Clearly, there are hundreds of cognitive biases, and they're all intertwined. They're all intertwined. We're really going to read it again and again and see how it applies to each of the case study and go out there. So for those of you involved in risk management, audit, strategy, business models, stakeholder engagement, investor relations, understand that things go wrong, not because by themselves, things go wrong because there's a risk source. So in terms of your communication, be able to communicate and help your stakeholders understand your resources, so that when things do go wrong, and they will go wrong, they're able to understand where you're coming from. So to me, a complete picture is a better way to manage. Remember in the last webinar, I said that it's easy to get angry, but to get angry for the right reason, for the right purpose, is not easy. So if your stakeholders understand your purpose and the way that you do things, they won't get angry so easily. So risk management is all about helping people understand why things go wrong. And when things go wrong, not because of your risk sources, then people are better placed to understand where you're coming from. So I hope that by now you're able to see how the cognitive biases fit into the risk management, how they fit into the case study. So another news article from New York Times, Samsung's insistence on speed and internal pressure to outdo rivals played a big part. There's a tone at the top. So in place of big ideas, instead of innovation, they focus on maxing out the capabilities of components like the battery. So it is that philosophy, that tone at the top, to keep Samsung at the heels of Apple. Simply is not effective as Samsung tries to push ahead. So purpose is important. So one of the webinars will be on purpose. Let me see, 4, 5, 6 webinar will be on purpose, and then on tone at the top. So this purpose, tone at the top, the resource, the culture, all this lead to things going wrong, lead to risk events happening within the organization. So like I say, this is a very exciting case study, and I encourage you to read through all these links here as you go through the case study. And last week I shared with you this book. So great book here. Oh, sorry, you can't see it. No, you can't read it. So I shared with you this book in the last webinar on business model. So as I was reading it, I thought I wanted to share with you this creature, this person called Eurodivi, a Russian word for the holy fool. So the concept of a person who is a truth teller, and in modern days equivalent, we call it the whistleblower. So risk management is not an end in itself. It should be involving the entire organization. So I know whistleblower is something that is seen negatively in many organizations, because think that is a snitch, people who tell things that should not be told. And but more important than not, in today's world, whistleblowing should be an integral part of risk management, because it helps to bring to light things which are inconvenient, or questions the things that the rest of us take for granted. Someone who is able to see beyond cognitive biases. So the next 2 slides are going to be important. So if traditional risk management is applicable halfway, so I'm not saying that it doesn't work, it needs to be completed. If we are affected by biases, so we've seen about 5 or 6 cognitive biases or behaviors, a blindness to how we manage risk. how do we then solve the problem? And the third part of my presentation is really looking at how we build resilience, having the ability to bounce back when risk management doesn't totally work. So risk management works to a certain extent. So once again, I'm saying that not saying that it doesn't totally work. It works to some extent. We're blinded by cognitive biases. So being able to bounce back when things go wrong is a final part to the equation so that you're more holistic in terms of how you're managing risk. And I'll bring you back to this World Economic Forum. So this is where the diagram comes from. It's a World Economic Forum report 2013 once again. So in the hyper-connected world, one nation's failure to address a global risk can have a ripple effect on others. So when countries, so you think about the pandemic, COVID-19, when one country's failure to address a risk can have a ripple effect on others. So not just a pandemic, but within your organization, within departments, if you don't manage risk within departments, intra-departments, inter-departments, between companies, you can't manage the risk because the ripple effect is going to affect us. So instead of the response to just managing risk, we must build resilience. So incorporate the ability to withstand when risks happen, to adapt and to recover from shocks is more critical. So this report was 7 years ago, and I totally believe that this is now even closer to what's important to our hearts now, being able to build resilience, because that the risks in which things is going to happen, the risk events are just accumulating faster and faster. The impact is becoming greater and greater. The things that's going wrong is greater and greater because the speed at which things has gone wrong, the number of resources are becoming greater and greater and greater. So resilience building is a final part of the equation that organizations must build into it. So you remember the 5x5 matrix about whether you're a ranking of 1 or 25 when you measure risk and by impact and likelihood. So that's a basic risk management. So the next slide that I will show you is the next level that you need to go to manage your risk. And this is the most important diagram here in today's presentation here. So here is how you read it. Strengthening resilience when you cannot, so if you have a low predictability, you cannot predict the risk. Remember, we have neglect of predictability or neglect of probability. As humans, as people, we have a low level, we have an innate inability. We are unable to predict risk. So probability of a risk, remember the shocking experiment, we are impervious to probability. So if probability is low and you have little knowledge of the risk, so a risk before it happened, it's very difficult to have knowledge of it. So we call it a black swan. We cannot predict a black swan until it happens, which is oxymoron, by the way. So if the amount of knowledge of the risk is low or small, then you end up with a situation where resilience is most applicable to unpredictable risk with little knowledge about the effective measures. So you cannot predict it and you don't know what the risk is all about, then this red box here is all about building resilience. How do you strengthen resilience? Being able to bounce back, being able to adapt, being able to adopt, and being able to recover from the risk when it happens. And these three other boxes is a variation of this red box here. I don't want to confuse you further because this matrix here needs a mindset shift to how you manage risk. Instead of the impact likelihood, this is by predictability and by knowledge of risk. So focus on the red box here and see where you fit in this 4 matrix box here. So instead of 25 boxes to focus on, you only have 4 boxes. So this, in a way, it seems simple. There are only 4 boxes compared to 25. But then again, simplicity is the most difficult thing to implement. Because you're going to ask myself, Wanchan, how do we strengthen the reliance? And this one is, you need to finish off all 8 webinars before you finally understand how do you strengthen resilience. Because it's all about building trust, strengthening resilience. Yeah. So I'm finishing soon. So this, I'm putting this in the red box here because this is your call to action. So please take a photo of this. But the slides will be available in the next couple of days, so you can download those slides. But This one, you have to share it, and for those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, please do share this on LinkedIn, because this is in order to strengthen their risk management processes. 4 more minutes to go before we finish off at 8. The next few slides are research that we have done. I'll leave it to you to download and read these slides, but this is a QR code. You can take a picture of it, or you can download the slides later. This link to all the research that Blackstone has done to look at how companies report on their risk. No surprises, typically the results. So that's why I didn't want to focus too much on the findings. No surprises, because most people adopt ISO 3100. Most companies look at it, they have risk matrix, a 5x5 or something similar. Most companies look at risk events, but few companies discuss risk sources or cognitive behaviors. So that's something that we hope to research more on in subsequent research. So here are the results on how do people communicate the risk in terms of who is responsible. So only 10% where no individuals are identified. So most people have do identify groups or classes of risk or principles of risk. Were there any companies that did not discuss risk? Some, about 13% had no discussion on risk. 30% Singapore, 27% in Malaysia, surprisingly had no discussion on risk. Discussion of overall risk appetite, these are the numbers. Tolerance for overall risk, discussion on individual risks, Singapore 57%, Malaysian 10%. So these are individual risks. Some insights into risk management systems. So 50% have basic overview of risk management, still some way to go. Detailed risk management discussion, also still some way to go. Linking remuneration risk management, some discussion, but still some way to go. Linking your sustainability reporting to risk management. You can see a significant jump for 2018 to 2019. I think this is around the time when SGX and Bursa Malaysia issued requirements for sustainability reporting for listed companies in Singapore and Malaysia. So probably that's why there's a significant jump over there. But the challenge is there's a link, but from what I can see, the link is not strong, it's just a link. There's no detailed discussion. So still room for improvement. We will analyze the quality of the links out there. So as promised, we finished by 8 o'clock. So 1 more minute to go. This is my last slide here. Failure is tough. So when things go wrong, it's tough. But when you're successful for the wrong reason. So based on the wrong reason, so you can't argue with success. So it's successful for the wrong reason, then the mix of praise and money out, just like the Samsung case study. So this is a good book by Paul Bronson, example of 50 case studies on how individuals find their purpose, but it can be applied to organizations also. So we talk about the books by Daniel Kahneman, by Dan Ariely, by Malcolm Gladwell on Talking to Strangers. So we talk about Paul Bronson. So quite a few books I've shared with you. Another one that I've not listed down but I spoke about Rolf Dobelli, Art of Thinking Clearly. It's a good textbook about 100 cognitive biases. But certainly I hope that by now, let me summarize, we have 1 more minute. So we look at the first part, risk management basics, how it's effective in terms of definition, but how it starts to be not so effective when you see it being applied in the 5x5 red, yellow, and green matrices, where you look at 25 ways of categorizing each event, but it's very event-based. But you need to go back to the root cause of the risk sources. The second part of the presentation, we look at 6 different cognitive biases. We look at neglect of probability, shocking experiment. We look at loss aversion. We look at risk shift. We look at go fever. We look at normalization of deviance. We look at outcome deviance, or you can't argue with success. And we look at the black swan cognitive bias, always similar to neglect of probability. So initially, we probably felt that it was very difficult to understand these cognitive biases, but probably by the time you went through the Samsung case study, it became a bit clearer, I totally understand that you need to go back and think about it carefully, especially loss aversion. It is a deceptively is difficult to easy to understand, but it's difficult when you try to dive a bit deeper. But finally, the third part of the presentation, we look at how the Samsung case study gave some light to how these cognitive biases made traditional risk management ineffective or not totally effective. And finally, we looked at how building resilience, being able to bounce back, can complement traditional risk management. And underlying this whole thing is really two major things: culture, short-term thinking that lead to all this risk happening. And we realized that in our first webinar on culture, engaging stakeholders, we look at business models, how we start to link with next more webinars on value creation, long-term thinking. In the long-term thinking, we look at purpose, we look at tone at the top, and finally we look at how to build in a sustainability framework. So sustainability is about how to build resilience, how to bounce back. So remember the word sustainable. Sustainable means being able to bounce back, having resilience building. So sustainability or any of these SASB, it's all about being able to bounce back on an ongoing basis with a long-term thinking to long-term value creation for stakeholders, for the organization. So with that, I'll be happy to end right here. So once again, the next webinar is value creation.